Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulihil Kareem amma ba'd. This is your brother Fahad Tasleem. So before we start off with the Q&A, questions and answers inshallah, just a couple of points related to the topic. And the topic itself is atheism. Now, one of the key questions that someone may ask is, can you prove the existence of God? Now, obviously, when it comes to atheism, this is the kind of the primary sticking point, you can say. And when it comes to the proof of the existence of God, it's an interesting perspective, because one of the things is that when you look at classical works on the existence of God, especially when you look at the Christian tradition, you find that proofs for the existence of God are given in a number of different types of arguments. So you have the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, and while those arguments may have some basis and they may have some veracity, you find that there is a certain issue related to those arguments. Okay, now the issue is, when it comes to atheism or the proof for the existence of God, we need to take a look at the tool that we'll be using to establish a proof. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, when you're going to prove something, one of the key tools that you're going to use, one of the epistemic tools you're going to use, is your rationale. And so because of your rationale, you say, well, I'm going to prove the existence of God and I'm going to use my rationale. Okay. But let's go ahead and take a look at rationality itself for a second. Because we're saying, okay, this is our primary tool. This is what we're going to use. Let's analyze this very tool. So when it comes to the idea of rationality, what we need to understand is that typically people categorize rationality into two categories. They say that something is either rational or irrational. So a rational statement is something like, I am Fahad. Okay, that's just a perfectly rational statement. Normal, rational, understandable statement. But an irrational statement is something like if I said, I'm a married bachelor. Now you may say, well, wait a minute, that makes no sense, because by definition, someone who's married is not a bachelor, and by definition, someone who's a bachelor is not married. Therefore, that's an irrational statement. But what if now I said, you know what? No, I'm going to stick to what I'm saying. I am a married bachelor. Now the issue is that while that statement is irrational, the issue arises is that someone isn't arguing about the statement, they're arguing about the logical principle upon which that statement is based. So what is that logical principle? The logical principle is that you cannot have two mutually exclusive items occurring at the same time. I cannot be Fahad and not Fahad at the very same time. But now what if someone said, no, I disagree with the principle itself? Meaning that logical principle of mutual exclusivity, they say, I disagree with it. Well, you see, that's not something that's in the realm of rationality or irrationality. That's something that lies outside of rationality. In other words, that logical principle, you cannot prove that principle because that's what rationality is based upon. You cannot prove the assumption, you just have to assume it. So the logical principle is that you cannot have two mutually exclusive items at the same time. You cannot have a square circle. Okay, fine. But if I say I disagree with the principle that you can't have two mutually exclusive things, there's nowhere you can go because you assume the principle. And so when we look at rationality, what we see is that rationality in fact has three categories, not just two. You have something that is irrational, contradictory. You have something that is rational, and then you have something that is super-rational, that which lies outside of rationality and that which rationality is dependent upon. So I gave the example. I said, okay, a married bachelor, rationality is dependent upon that. And so that lies outside of rationality. That's something that you cannot prove, but you must assume before you move forward. So there are certain elements that lie outside of rationality that the rationale cannot prove, but that rationality is dependent upon. Now, in the Islamic parlance, this supra-ration or the supra-rationality is what we call the fitrah. And things that are present within the fitrah are things like rational principles, like I mentioned. Aesthetic tastes are in the fitrah. The moral concepts of justice and injustice, are in the supra-rational or the fitrah. So all of these things are not things that you can prove, but you need in order for you to move forward and have a comprehensive view of a comprehensive worldview in terms of existing. Now, someone could say, no, I don't agree with this idea of a supra-rational. I think that you can rationally prove every single thing. And if you can't rationally prove it, then I'm not going to believe it. Okay. But you see, there's a certain issue with that. Because what do we say when we're talking about rationality? What we say is that we're asking the question of why. And that question of why can go on, well, it can't go on ad infinitum. Right? So the example I sometimes give, I say, look, imagine my son, and he's, 10 years old, and he comes and he takes a knife out of the kitchen. And I say, well, look, son, you can't take that knife. He says, why? Now, this is a rational question. He says, why? I said, well, because it's sharp, and it'll cut you. He said, well, why will it cut me? I said, well, because it's sharp. He said, well, why is it sharp? Well, because that's how the manufacturer made it. Well, why? Well, because they made it so it would be sharp so it could cut things. Well, why? So it could cut things like fruit. Well, why? Well, because fruit is easier to eat when it's cut. Well, why? Well, because of how the function... And the point is at a certain point I'd have to tell him, because I said so, right? That's why. A person cannot ask why infinitely back. Meaning you cannot consistently ask why. Because there has to be a stopping point. And that stopping point, this question of why, which is in the rationality, lies outside of the rationality. Something that you cannot prove, but without it, you can't move forward. Now let's assume someone says, you know what? Again, I don't believe in the super-rational. You can ask why. Forever. Well, the problem is the only place that will take you, in other words, you basically ask why about everything, it means you doubt everything. You're basically doubting. Right? You're asking why. And so everything has this element of doubt to it. But the issue is that if that's the case, then the only place you're left is you're basically left in a state of being a skeptic. You doubt everything. First of all, no one lives their life like that. You don't doubt and question and rationally try to analyze every single thing in your life. Imagine now your mother calls and you pick up the phone and you say, it says mom. I wonder if it's my mom. It says mom. Let me see. Hello? Your mom says, hello, son. You say, well, it sounds like my mom, but maybe it's not my mom. How do I know it's my mom? So this extreme doubt, it's problematic, and nobody lives their life like that. No one asks why infinitely or has this infinite loop of doubt. The second issue with that, number one, it's completely impractical. Number two is that if you say that you doubt everything, then you have to doubt your doubt, which leaves you intellectually paralyzed. So really, you have to now say that there is some absolute that is not relative, that lies outside of rationality, by which rationality functions, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the Islamic parlance, we call this the fitrah. These are elements within what is known as the fitrah. And this fitrah is what what God created the human being upon. And the very idea of the existence of God is found within the fitrah. Because nobody can move forward with a proper worldview in terms of their life without saying that there's an absolute. Because if someone says there's no absolute, then this person is saying that they have to question everything. And they're going to ask why about everything, but we already mentioned the issues with that. So, you have the super-rational, the rational, and those things that are irrational. And the existence of God is something that lies within the super-rational. It is, in Islamic terms, a fitri concept. It is within the fitrah of the human being. Now, this idea of the rationality, or of the rational, is, someone gave an example. If you say, look, I can rationally prove, I say that I can rationally prove anything. It's like the guy that says, I have the universal solvent. It can dissolve anything. But you want to ask this person, what bottle will you keep that solvent in? You see, the rationale, it's a great tool. It's an amazing tool, but it still needs a bottle to be kept in. And that bottle that is kept in is what we call the super-rational. Because if you say rationality is, you'll be able to rationally prove anything, it itself will break itself down without an anchor. And that anchor is what we call the super-rational. So, when it comes to this idea of the existence of God, we find that it is a supra-rational concept because we're talking about that which is absolute. In fact, we say God is absolute. In fact, the term absolute, that's what it refers to. It's absolute, right? We're talking about the universal solvent, that which is not, that which cannot be dissolved, that which cannot be, that which is like, that which is not soluble, and it's not solvable, meaning you cannot rationally prove it, but it's there. So it's absolute, that which is not solvable, or that which is not soluble. It's something that lies outside of rationality, and you have to accept it, but you cannot prove it. Now, let's not confuse that with something that's irrational. So something that's irrational is, like I said, being a married bachelor. That's irrational. That's something you can use your rationality and move forward. But something that is super irrational, just because you can't prove it with rationality doesn't mean it's wrong. In fact, it is a necessary component of one's worldview, because without it, all you have is doubt. So, when it comes to the existence of God itself, we say that this is a supra-rational concept. It is a concept that lies within what we call the fitra, or the super-rational. And we mention other concepts that are in the super-rational. Concepts like the idea of justice, what is just and what is unjust. Concept like aesthetic tastes. And by the way, this idea of the super-rational, it's very interesting because it goes back to an element of the human being that we don't tend to think about much, especially in the day and age that we live in. So because we live in a modern day and age, there's a hyper focus on the material body. And because of this hyper focus on the material body, we forget that the human being is a composite of two elements, of a spiritual element and a physical element. Now, within the Islamic framework, that spiritual element is known as the ruh. And it's this ruh that we have within ourselves that, again, is not something that you rationally prove, but yet every human being accepts it. Like, let's just take a step back. You know, within scientific circles, they have this issue of what's known as a hard problem of consciousness. In other words, we understand that we have a physical body. We have, within the physical body, we have a mind, we have a brain. The brain has neurons, it has its own elements. So the question arises that you as a human being, you have a consciousness. You're conscious of things. Now, how does that consciousness from this organic material that's there, this physical, in a sense, dead organic material, how exactly do you get consciousness from this material? It's in the scientific circles is known as the hard problem of consciousness. Within the Islamic framework, we say that that very idea of consciousness is because the human being is a composite of two things, the material body and the ruh, and the spirit. And this spiritual element is that element which is longing for its maker, longing for its creator, longing for the absolute, longing for God. It's an interesting passage in the Quran in what's known as the chapter of prostration, Surah Sajda. And, the Quran, as, Muslims believe that this is the speech of God. And so in the Quran, in this chapter, what's very interesting is that when God is speaking about the creation of the human being, he's speaking about it in the third person. So, and I'll say I'll say it very quickly now. It starts off, الَّذِي أَحْسَنَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَهُ, and then he is the one who created everything in the best of forms. وَبَدَأَ خَلْقَهُ مِنْ طِينٍ, and he created this human being from this element of like dirt or the earth. ثم جعل نسله من سلالة من ماء مهين. And then he moved generations forward by this sperm mixture. Now you notice this is all in the third person so far. So this material, this organic material, Allah or God is speaking about it in the third person. So he created this material, started off with this material from the earth, referring to Adam, and then generations move forward by this mixture, which is this mixture, this sperm-like mixture is what the term is referring to. Again, it's still in the third person. So then Allah or God says in the Quran that he created things in the best of form. He started the creation with from this dirt-like mixture, this dirt or this thin, and then he moved generations forward from this sperm-like mixture, and then he says ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ, and then we formulated. In other words, from the sperm-like mixture, we formed it. ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِهِ, and then he blew into it the ruah. Now, all of this is in the third person. He's talking about something external, third person. And then he says, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبَصَارَ وَالْأَفِيدَةَ. And then I made for you, now he's moved to the second person, the ability to see, the ability to hear, and the ability to think. Now, why is that significant? Because initially, God is speaking in the third person, saying this organic material that we have, that I put all this together, it doesn't have a ruah. It doesn't have a spiritual element to it. Right now it's just, and that's why he's talking about it in the third person. But as soon as the ruah, that spiritual element, is placed within that organic material, that in a sense dead organic material, now it moves to the second person. And I made for you the ability to see, the ability to hear, and the ability to think. Why? Because now that human being has a consciousness and God can speak to it because it has a consciousness. So anyway, I guess my point with all of that is to say that this spiritual element, this is what we are speaking about when we speak about the idea of the absolute at the end of the day. And how you recognize that absolute comes from something deeper than the rationale. And if that's the case, then it comes from something that is internal to the human being. And so, therefore, that element that's internal within the human being, it's that internal element that's going to recognize the existence of the Creator. In fact, when you go to the Quran, you'll notice that the Quran isn't full of rational arguments per se. In other words, it doesn't have discursive argumentation or discursive reasoning in the Quran when it comes to the existence of God. In other words, A, B, therefore C. But it speaks in terms of what are known as ayat. And this, in a general sense, can be translated as signs. In other words, the existence of God is deep within the human being. We already know that because there has to be an absolute. The human being can't function, can't have an appropriate worldview without an absolute. Because again, like we said, if there's no absolute, you're just in doubt. And you have to doubt your doubt, which in case leaves you going nowhere, basically. So that absolute, it's deep within the human being. The Quran speaks in terms of ayat, which are signs, to awaken that internal knowledge or gnosis of God. And that's why this term ayat is used. So the term ayat means sign. And a sign is something, if you think about it, the sign, an ayah, is something that it's not, you don't require some sort of new information that's added, right? So let me give you an example. Let's assume now, I graduated from Michigan State University, and when you graduate from a university, they give you rings, right? So you have like university rings. Let's say 10 years pass now, and I'm moving, and I'm going through my stuff, and I find that ring. Now, what happens when I find that ring is all of those memories, all of those feelings, all of those elements that I sensed or I had at the time when I graduated come rushing back. This one ring is a sign for all of those things. So I remember, walking across the stage, getting my degree, seeing the look on my parents' face. And they were so happy and proud, and all of those elements come rushing back. Now, that ring that I just saw, I didn't learn something new, but yet it awakened something that's deep within inside that before that, a cover had been put on top of it. when it comes to the ayat, or the signs that God speaks about in the Quran, you notice that there's some signs that talk about the natural world. Inna fi khalqis samawati wal ard, in the creation of the heavens and the earth. وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ, in the alteration of the night and the day. If a person were to come now and seriously sit down and just ponder and think deeply about the heavens and the earth, how did they get here? What was their source? It strikes something deep within the human being. In fact, the concept of awe is something that is difficult for an empiricist to really buckle down and understand. This idea of awe. Like if you were to go to visit the Niagara Falls, and it's amazing. These falls that are so large, and the water, and inside the human being, it strikes something. You have this sense of awe, and that's where you get the word awesome, by the way. But it has this sense of awe that's deep within the human being, and that sense of awe is basically what God is referring to when He's talking about some of those ayat, or those signs within the creation of the heavens and the earth. When you go out and you start looking at just the sky itself, it's supposed to have something deep within the human being. Now, there are ayat, there are signs related to the heavens and the earth outside. There's signs related to the human being, like reflecting upon how you yourself, what you are as a human being. If you think about your being, like who are you? It's an interesting verse in the Quran where God says that the ones that forgot God, He caused them to forget themselves. If you think about who you are, you're more than just a material being. Who are you as a person, right? So if I said, look, you have your material being, and let's say you lose an arm, do you cease being you? You lose 2 arms, do you cease being you? You lose both your legs, God forbid. Do you cease? No. But there's something that's you that's not only your body. So you have this idea of this difference between when a certain material is dead versus it being alive. What is that concept of life? What is you as a human being? When you forget about you, when you forget about God, you're actually forgetting about yourself, because you've now separated this idea of a physical body versus this idea of who you are. What is your essence? What is who you are? So anyhow, so you have ayat, signs that point towards the creation of the heavens and the earth, signs that point towards oneself. How did you get here? What is your purpose? Why do you have a rationale? Why do you have a consciousness? All of these things are signs for the human being to reflect upon. And then you have signs within the Quran itself. Like, where did this Quran come from? Right? And this was a question I was teaching in class the other day. And someone asked, well, who wrote the Quran? And we said, well, there's a lot of theories about people who don't believe what the Quran claims. But if you ask the Quran who wrote the Quran, or who the author of the Quran is, the Quran says, Tanzilu min Rabbil Alameen. This is a revelation from the creator of the heavens and the earth. So there are signs within the Quran itself. And all of these signs are pointing towards you to strike something deep within the human being, to remember and to go back and see that indeed there is a creator. Again, it's not something that you rationally prove, because rationality is, in a sense, limited, in the sense that you can't rationally prove everything. There's some things outside of rationality that you must accept in order to have a comprehensive and correct worldview. Otherwise, you can't function. And frankly, you can't go anywhere without assuming that there's an absolute. And from the Islamic point of view, that absolute, that is Allah, that is God. And in the Quran it says, Allahu Samad. Allah is the absolute. There's nothing beyond that. Okay, so I'll go ahead and field some questions now. Very quickly, let's see. Okay, so the question is, when I was in school, I learned that books were written, and this is written by humans. That then made me question things like the Bible. Why should I not believe that they're all fiction? Why is it the truth? Oops. Why can't I see this question properly. So Matt, it looks like you were questioning things within the Bible, and therefore, so you should, from there, assume that all books, are all fiction, like the Bible. I mean, it's an interesting question, but keep in mind that just because the Bible didn't quite, I guess, didn't quite add up in certain areas. I don't want to disrespect anyone in that regard. But so then to say that, okay, well, if the Bible doesn't make sense in certain areas or doesn't sit well with me, therefore no religious text will make sense. But the thing is, you can't really make that determination until you've gone through the other religious texts. Because, you can't draw an analogy, because the analogy would be somewhat false. Because the assumption is that the Bible is the greatest religious text out there, in a sense, and therefore anything less than that, any other book that claims to be the truth, cannot match up. If the Bible, doesn't match up, isn't correct, then everything else must not be correct. But you see, I think that's a bit of a jump. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to go through the Quran itself, and from a very open-minded perspective. One of the things that when it comes to understanding the truth, that is that there are not only intellectual hurdles that one would need to cross, right? So in other words, we want to now understand something rationally, but there are also spiritual elements that we want to understand as well. Because remember, I said the human being is made up of both the body and the spirit. So when it comes to rationality and rationally understanding, what we say is that within Islam, within the Quran, you will not find anything that is irrational. Now remember, since there's three categories of rationality, there's the super rational, that which is outside of rationality, the rational, and then there's irrational. Within the Islamic framework, within the Quran, you will never find anything that is irrational. It is all rational. And in addition to that, it assumes the super rational. So therefore, if you may have found something in the Bible that you thought was okay, that was irrational, I would encourage you to come to the Quran and take a fresh pair of eyes and take a look at it. And understand that there's not only this idea of rationality, but also about spirituality. When you come to the Quran, I would advise you to come with an open heart and open mind. Because remember, the idea of seeking the truth is both a spiritual function and a rational function. All right, let's see what other questions we have here. Okay. Let's see. So what is Islam's view on extraterrestrials? Most of ancient civilizations around the globe had evidence that they've been here. I don't think Islam has a specific view on extraterrestrials per se. That being said, there's nothing that says there aren't any, and there isn't anything that says that there definitely are. So, because at the end of the day, look, the purpose of Islam, when we think about Islam, and we think about the Quran, we think about the function of the human being. The purpose that Islam came with is to guide the human being. It's guidance, first and foremost. And so therefore, it's supposed to give you spiritual nutrition. And that spiritual nutrition is supposed to guide you both rationally and spiritually. And therefore, one of the things that when someone reads the Quran, and especially let's say when they compare it to the Bible, they'll notice is that there's a lot of details that are not in the Quran. Like when it talks about certain stories of the prophets of the past, certain details that you find in the Bible you won't find in the Quran. Why? Because the Quran, the function of the Quran is to guide the human being. It's to give you a spiritual guidance where you can live a spiritually fulfilling life. And therefore, a lot of those details, they're not there because they don't add anything when it comes to the function of guiding the human being to the truth and guiding the human being on the spiritual path. Let's see what other questions we have. All right. Let's see. Okay. All right. Let's see. Everything else looks like they're just comments, not specific questions. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and post them, because a lot of this other stuff is just commentary. Okay. So does anyone have any questions per se? It's hopefully what we're trying to get to. Unless I'm not able to see them, so let's take a look. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like that's pretty much it for the questions. I don't see anything else. And it's going to some other political, economic issues of some sort, which are not really related to the topic. So, all right. I think someone's still asking about aliens. Most of the extraterrestrial beings have a higher spiritual or knowledge, and that's why they're far advanced than us. Shouldn't that be the aliens? I'm not really quite understanding the question. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap it up here then, because I don't see any other questions per se related to the topic. Like I said, a lot of kind of commentary that's going on related to all sorts of other things, economics and what have you. All right. So, any questions pertaining to the topic before I log off here? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up here then. I appreciate everyone that was able to log in, and basically any sort of Q&A. No. Okay. Okay. Well, that being said, I'll go ahead and stop here. Jazakumullah khair. And just as a further note, if you guys have any more questions, definitely check out eDialogue. I think they have a chat function by which you can chat with someone, and you can basically have any other, if some sort of other questions come up later after this Facebook Live. So with that said, Jazakumullah khair. I'll go ahead and log off here. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.